You and I have both seen political headlines that read more like dramatic teasers than policy updates. United States issues new warning to Canada. Canada hits back in ways no one expected. It's easy to treat stories like that as background noise in the never-ending drama of modern politics, something you glance at, feel a moment of anxiety about, and then move on. Before we go deeper into what changed and why it matters, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button so you don't miss any future deep dive reports. But this confrontation deserves more than a passing glance because it raises a deeper question. If this is more than a spat between neighbors, if it's actually a stress test of the economic system that holds North America together, what exactly is being tested, and what did we just learn? The goal here isn't to pick sides, but to look at how power behaves when economies are deeply intertwined, and why this moment reveals something important about American influence, Canadian strategy, and the health of the larger framework both countries depend on. On the surface, the trigger seemed simple. The United States Trade Representative floated the idea that Washington might let the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, wither when renewal comes up, or at least reopen it under conditions that felt more like pressure than partnership. Around the same time, political rhetoric in Washington suggested Canada should behave less like a sovereign partner and more like an extension of American policymaking, a 51st state in everything but name. None of this was framed as economic aggression. It was presented as tough realism, a needed correction to what some believe is an unbalanced relationship. But anyone who has lived under a major trade agreement, whether they operate a farm, a small business, or work inside cross-border supply chains, understands something critical. Threatening to walk away from an agreement like USMCA isn't symbolic. It shakes the table that everything else is sitting on. To understand why, we have to be clear about what USMCA actually is. It isn't a friendly memorandum or a ceremonial pledge. It is the governing structure for how goods, services, capital, and entire industries move across three economies that share borders, energy grids, and deeply integrated supply chains. It shapes decisions about factories, mortgages, hiring, infrastructure planning, and long-term investment. Disrupt the foundation, and you inject uncertainty into millions of lives, whether or not those people have ever read a trade agreement. In Washington, the assumption behind the threats was straightforward. The U.S. is the largest economy in the arrangement. Canada is smaller and more dependent on the American market. Therefore, a strong warning should compel Ottawa to yield on energy rules, manufacturing standards, digital policy, agriculture, or anything Washington wanted to renegotiate. This reflects the classic belief of any dominant power. Size guarantees leverage, and leverage guarantees compliance. But interdependence doesn't behave like a simple lever. Pull too hard, and the force can ricochet back in unexpected ways. Canada's response disrupted the script. There was no panic, no public capitulation, no sudden scramble for reassurance. Instead, Canadian policymakers and businesses treated the threats as confirmation of something they had sensed for years. Relying overwhelmingly on the United States carried increasing risk. If the larger partner began treating stability as a bargaining chip, then the smaller partner had to ask a sobering question. What if the anchor we depend on is no longer dependable? That question changed behavior immediately. Canada accelerated ongoing efforts to diversify export markets, expand energy routes, and deepen ties with Europe, Asia, South America, and emerging economies. What once looked like side projects became strategic pillars. Certain Canadian energy regions now send most of their output elsewhere, a dramatic shift years in the making, driven by one basic principle familiar to any household or business. If one partner holds too much power over your future, prudence demands reducing that dependence. Here is where the episode becomes counterintuitive. When a powerful country tries to weaponize interdependence, It doesn't just pressure the smaller partner. It teaches that partner how to live with less of it. Once Canadian industries realized they could restructure supply chains around reduced U.S. exposure, and once foreign investors noticed Canada was becoming the more predictable option, leverage quietly began to shift. Capital flows followed. Investors crave stability, and when Washington implied that even USMCA could become unstable, it signaled something far larger. American policy had become less predictable than the world assumed. That revelation had consequences. Canada used the uncertainty as momentum. It expanded its trade architecture, improved domestic supply capacity, and positioned itself as the stable North American entry point for foreign investment. Meanwhile, in the United States, the pressure campaign produced the opposite effect of what policymakers intended. Threats did not create discipline. They created doubt. Manufacturers accustomed to seamless cross-border operations suddenly had to consider tariffs, delays, or new rules of origin. Companies paused hiring, postponed major investments, or shifted production preparations abroad. Supply chains that took decades to refine began to look fragile. Uncertainty became an economic tax felt in slowing growth, weaker confidence, and extended periods of manufacturing contraction. Consumers felt the instability too, through higher prices, disrupted shipping, and muted retail performance. Meanwhile, Canadian industries began nearshoring production, not out of nationalism, but out of necessity, strengthening domestic suppliers and shortening supply lines to reduce exposure to U.S. unpredictability. And as Canada strengthened its alternatives, something Washington had not fully recognized became clear. U.S. industries were deeply reliant on Canadian inputs. Transportation equipment, advanced manufacturing, critical minerals, and energy processing all depended on stable Canadian supply. When threats shook that stability, American industries felt the tremors first. The result was a feedback loop Washington did not expect. As Canadian dependence on the U.S. declined, American vulnerability became more visible. The U.S. had assumed its economy was untouchable. The episode revealed the opposite. In an interconnected economy, power rests less on size than on reliability. The moment reliability is questioned, the system reorganizes. Canada reorganized quickly. The United States hesitated. And in that hesitation, influence began to shift. Over time, two truths emerged. First, Canada was no longer a passive participant. It became a more resilient, adaptive actor, building a dual-tracked economic model, one integrated with the U.S. and another connected to a wider, more stable global network. Second, the United States inadvertently exposed its own fragility by signaling that even bedrock agreements could be renegotiated through threats rather than strategy. In a world where capital moves faster than politics and stability is a premium commodity, that signal mattered more than any press release. If you want breakdowns like this delivered regularly, make sure to subscribe and leave a like to support this type of investigative reporting.